All right, so I am Linda Durhack, and welcome to this University of Illinois Extension Local Government Education webinar. Today, we will be discussing the Thriving Communities Grantmaking Program, which opened in December. This webinar is co-sponsored by Prairie Rivers Network and the Great Lakes Thriving Community Technical Assistance Center with funding from the U.S. EPA and Department of Energy. Some of the services we offer include identifying grant opportunities, eligibility, and grant review. I will include our website in the chat if you're interested in learning more. Today, we have one speaker. They will present and then we will take questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat and we will share questions with the speaker during the Q&A at the end. Depending on the question, we may answer in the chat as well. We are recording this webinar and you will get a link to the recording and contact information for the speaker in the next few days. You can always find the local government education webinars on our YouTube channel. So with all of that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Ryan Alaniz serves as the REAMP Network Director for Rural Outreach for the EPA Region 5 of the Thriving Communities Grantmaking Program. He will provide an overview of the program and specific information for rural communities to apply. His goal is to bring federal funding to disinvested communities in Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin to address environmental and public health challenges. He is also a professor of sociology at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, who's currently on leave. His research has focused on disaster recovery, resilience, community, and international development. We're very grateful to have him with us here today, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Linda, Nancy, the Prairie Rivers Network and the University of Illinois Extensions. I really appreciate the opportunity to share about this grant that is aimed at rural and remote communities. 25% of the grant, as I'll explain later, of $40 million will be going to rural communities. And then the other funding will be going to urban and tribal communities. Thank you for this opportunity. My goal is to present in about 25 to 30 minutes and then to take the rest of the time for questions and answers. And if we even have extra time, perhaps you can have lunch. Again, my name is Ryan Alaniz. My background, I grew up on a farm. My dad was a tractor driver and a farm supervisor, and I worked in the fields for 4 summers as well. Grew up very rural and have a good understanding of rural communities, and I get to place that with my academic research on disaster recovery, resilience, community building, etc. So I'm very excited to talk to you folks about this opportunity and see whether or not it's a good fit for you. I will at the end I will send to Nancy information and Linda information that may help you decide whether this is a good grant and then how to apply for the grant, as well as other resources as well that would be useful, including a link to slides, a more robust set of slides than the one I'm going to be presenting. So the way I thought about this is, if I was in your shoes, what would I want to know? And I came up with a few questions. The first was, who's managing this program? Where is it coming from? What are the program's goals, priorities? Who can apply? What are the qualifications? What are those 3 grant tiers you may have heard about? Anywhere from $25,000 to $350,000. What is the timeline for application and then also the providing funding? And I want to introduce also colleagues of mine at REAMP, the REAMP network, called Federal Navigators, who can also help, especially rural communities and organizations working with rural communities, apply for this grant as well as state and federal grants. And finally, of course, some Q&A. So the program is bringing together 4 partners. The umbrella partner is the Minneapolis Foundation. They're the fiduciary sponsor. They're the ones who will be handling all the applications. And then the 3 smaller nonprofits that are working together to do outreach and then also support grantees is the Midwest Environmental Justice Network, who's focused on urban outreach. And urban is defined as over 50,000. I know Growing up, over 20,000 seemed like a huge city, but the EPA defines it as over 50,000. The NDN Collective is focusing on tribal outreach, the 36 tribes in our 6-state Region 5 area, and myself with the REAMP network focusing on rural and remote communities. So what is REAMP? Many of you may have never heard about it. We are a group of about 141 organizations who focus on equitably eliminating greenhouse gases in the Midwest by 2050. So that's our North Star goal. And then within that, we also are working on other different types of activities. Our motto is thinking systemically, acting collaboratively. And the idea is that in the Midwest, for example, Illinois and Wisconsin folks may be dealing with some of the same issues like nitrates in the water, but they're not necessarily communicating with each other because of distance and time, etc. Our goal is to try to bring folks together so that they can communicate, break down the silos, and help one another in the process of the issues that they're trying to resolve. So who is supporting the program? We have two major, what are called TIC-TACs, or Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers, which is the Great Lakes Environmental Justice TIC-TAC and the Blacks and Greens in Chicago. So University of Minnesota and Minneapolis, St. Paul. But we have other partners as well, like the Prairie Rivers Network, the Environmental Protection Network, among many others. But going to these two will enable you to connect with it. They can help you connect with other groups and organizations that can support an application. So what are the goals of this program? It's pretty straightforward. The EPA, through the Inflation Reduction Act, has funding to go into disadvantaged communities. That's their terminology. In rural communities, I like to use disinvested communities to do environmental justice work. Again, in rural communities, I don't necessarily always use environmental justice, but to thinking about clean water, clean air, and public health issues. So this funding is to really help folks deal with the issues of climate, and as well as various public health challenges that they may be facing. As I mentioned, we may have up to $48 million. Right now we have $40 million, so I actually need to change that. And we're looking at distributing approximately 200 to 250 grants. It depends on how much each grantee is requesting. And those grants are anywhere from $25,000 to $350,000. So it's a good amount of money for especially a small community to start a project or complete a project. So I just took a snapshot of what's called the EJ screen, or the Environmental Justice Screen from the EPA. This is a mapping tool, which I'll be sure to send a link to. And so grants must, or applicants must meet these two different qualifications. The first is that a project must be in a disadvantaged community. And these orange communities or orange census tracts are defined by the EPA as disadvantaged and therefore eligible to receive these grants. Now, a lot of organizations and communities may have some census tracts that are seen as disadvantaged and others that are not. The idea is that the vast majority, the bulk of the effort and money will flow into those disadvantaged communities. And some might also benefit non-disadvantaged communities. But again, the focus is on these census tracts, these disadvantaged communities. The second, as I mentioned earlier, is that the project must address some environmental or public health challenge. I will be giving you examples that the EPA has said I can use. Now, there's very few that I'm going to share with you, but I want you to think very broadly about what that means. The reason is that the very few examples don't necessarily always resonate with the rural community. And we want this to be community-led. So the community knows best what the challenges are for itself. So rather than our program going into Morris, Minnesota, for example, and saying, this is what you need to do, this is the only way you can use these fundings, this funding, it's actually the opposite. We want communities to say, here's our challenge, here's our need, and here's how we want to use the funding. And we say, yes, here is funding to help you resolve issues around lead in the water or air quality issues, etc. So it must be within a disadvantaged community, and it must address one of the environmental or public health challenge. I just took a snapshot of Urbana-Champaign. I was just interested to see what the census tracts would look like. I've unfortunately never been in that part of the world, in that part of the country yet, but this is what the census tracts look like. So again, orange is recognized as disadvantaged and blue is recognized as not disadvantaged. So we also have created some characteristics that we are going to prioritize, and these will probably make sense to many of you. We prioritize in terms of the application federally recognized tribes, community-led and feasible projects. So some communities may want to do a very big project like a resilience hub, and it's going to take 5 years. And that scope is not within the boundaries of this 2-year grant or 1-year grant period. So the idea would be for that community, if they want to develop a resilience hub, for example, they would take a part of that and say, this is what we're going to accomplish in 1 to 2 years. Some other characteristics of the organization is that they will be prioritized if they have a budget of less than $5 million, if they have less than 10 full-time staff, and if they've been formed in the past 5 years. Again, with rural communities, this is a little bit different because there may be a government entity like a regional development office, for example, that is able to support communities and be the fiduciary sponsor of a community wanting to obtain this grant. In that case, that regional development office, because there isn't a community-based organization working with these remote communities, will not be penalized if they have 12 full-time staff members, for example. That's not the goal. What we're thinking is that we don't want some big organization to come and parachute down into these communities so that they could receive the funding. The communities as well will be prioritized if they've received a disaster declaration in the past 5 years and if they're under 10,000 people. The distribution of the grants will be different based on demographics. So 45% of the funding will go to urban communities, 25% to rural. So of that $40 million, about 10 million we're going to be focusing as best as we can. That $10 million will be going to rural and remote, and then 30% will be going to tribes and indigenous communities. So who can apply? Tribal governments, Native American, indigenous organizations, and that includes tribal colleges, nonprofit organizations. Most are 501c3, but we just learned 501c4s and 501c6s are also available. We think 501c5s are also able to apply. Local governments, regional governments, for example, just not statewide government. And this also includes school districts. And finally, institutions of higher education, colleges and universities. So there's 3 tiers, and I'll talk about, I have a slide for each one of these tiers, but just as an introduction, if you think of maybe a project life cycle, this is one way of thinking about these tiers. So tier 1 is the initial, we have a problem. How do we go about learning about this problem, assessing it, and starting to bring people together to start to figure out what we can actually do? Tier 2 is sharing that information with people or creating a specific community education project. An example that I'll be giving a little bit later might be a training, solar installation training, for example. Solar installers, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is the fastest growing occupation in the country. And so that might be a community education project, a job training project. But that could be planning, that could start, maybe there needs to be, if there's a building involved, maybe an architect or an engineer, et cetera, needs to be hired to do an investigation. And finally, tier 3, project development and implementation, thinking more shovel-ready projects or trying to help projects cross the finish line. Now, tier 1, you can see there's actually kind of a tier 1A and a tier 1B is the way I think about it. A tier 1A, or the grant up to $150,000, is competitive. Tier 1, maybe B, or tier 1 non-competitive, is when an organization or a community is able to meet those characteristics, those priority characteristics I mentioned earlier. They will be invited by the Minneapolis Foundation to apply for a $75,000 non-competitive grant. Now, they don't have to apply for it. They can continue to apply for any of the tiers, but that is just another way of kind of supporting these smaller capacity-constrained organizations and communities. And one other thing I wanted to note about these 3 tiers is tier 1 has a funding model where an organization can receive up to 50% of the funding up front. And then once they meet certain mile markers, project markers, they're able to receive the rest of the funding. Tier 2 and tier 3 is reimbursement only. So for sure, we can have things reimbursed by quarterly, but the goal of the Minneapolis Foundation would be able to reimburse folks monthly, if at all possible. So those are 2 considerations worth taking into account. Also, organizations can apply for up to 2 grants, but if an organization like a regional development organization, for example, is the fiduciary sponsor of multiple projects, each one of those projects is able to obtain 2 grants. Another community, for example, may obtain up to 2 grants, and the organization itself can receive 2 grants as a fiduciary sponsor. So as I mentioned before, this is not comprehensive, but these are the only examples that the EPA is allowing me to give. So the project must focus on environmental justice, such as environmental health, healthy homes, and that can include things like energy efficiency, as I mentioned, pipes, lead pipes, etc. Access to healthy food, so maybe community gardens, stormwater and green infrastructure, including solar panels, emergency preparedness and disaster resilience, addressing issues of pesticides and other toxic substances, environmental job training for youth or adults, and other. That's the category I want you all to be thinking about, because what do the communities need and how does it fit within these 2 broad categories of environmental issues and public health challenges? So just a few examples of tier 1. Again, I think of this as kind of the initial effort or the initial part of a bigger project, but it could also be focused much more on educational issues. What you can see with all of these tiers is that they overlap, and for example, if you're not quite sure which tier the project fits into, that would be a great conversation to have with one of the technical assistance centers I mentioned earlier. Worst case scenario, if you apply for a tier 2, but actually you're a good fit for a tier 3, the regional advisory committee, which will be making the decisions on these grants, could go back and say, this actually seems more like a better fit in a tier 3. Is that something you'd be interested in applying for? So it's not as if it's a one-off and you're set forever. It's more of a conversation. So tier one, again, the initial investigation of an issue, figuring out how the community might come together to try and address the challenge. So the examples that the EPA gives is air, water, or soil sampling testing monitoring, purchasing monitoring equipment, mapping. And one example I was thinking about is mapping wells in rural communities and trying to recognize where pollution might be in different wells to figure out where it might be coming from. Community-focused research, surveys, and studies. Power mapping, public engagement and public education. Tier two, again, that's kind of the medium time frame of a big project. So you know what the problem is, and you just need to start getting people together and start to really jump into it, really work on it. So developing those project plans, communicating about what the problem is or the issue is, getting more support. Could be trainings, toolkits, or guidelines. The example, again, I had mentioned is solar installers. Gatherings, workshops, and trainings. Creating local advisory committees. Developing emergency preparedness plans. And finally, this is tier two and tier three. Up to 50% of the funding can be used for land acquisition or construction, building construction. Finally, tier three, again, trying to move or complete a bigger project. Could be dealing with environmental or public health protection initiatives, increasing access to healthy food, remediation, for example, of brownfields, water efficiency programs, green infrastructure, again, like solar, internship, environmental workforce development, and finally, again, 50% can be used for property acquisition and construction. So the timeline is a little bit expedited. Now, we haven't made any decisions yet. The very first round is starting in January 31st. So all applications by January 31st will go into the first round to be decided upon by the Regional Advisory Committee. And around 3 months later, the applicant will find out whether or not they received the funding. So again, once that first happens in January 31st, there's going to be a rolling deadline, and we'll let folks know when the next deadline will be. We're again expecting 3 to 4 months to give the Regional Advisory Committee the opportunity to make decisions. And then a big deadline here, fall 2026. So all funds have to be distributed by fall 2027. Which means even the smallest project has a year-long time frame in which they can complete their project. So we have to go back a year for application. So we're looking at fall, maybe even summer 2026 as a final deadline for receiving. Now, if folks want a tier two or tier three 2-year grant, they need to be thinking about fall 2025. So then all the funds can be spent by fall 2027. And so if there's any questions about that, I'm happy to share a little bit more. So the grant process, we're imagining will take approximately 4 months. We've tried to make the intake form, which should only take about 15, 20 minutes, very simple and straightforward. And the application, we're thinking if a person hasn't applied before for this grant, maybe 10 hours, but if they already have a lot of the information that they need, maybe 8 hours total for the application. So you divide that by, say, $250,000, you're looking at, what is it, $4,000 an hour or something? I don't know. I'm a sociologist, not a mathematician, so maybe somebody can fix my math. Anyway, it's a lot of money that folks are able to receive for their work. So the first thing after you attend, which you've already done, you're attending right now a presentation, is to submit the intake form. And this allows us to start to communicate with you directly. This is, even if you're not quite sure what your project is, it's not fully defined, it's great to do an intake form so that communication can start happening. We can let you know about, we just had, for example, a webinar on construction costs. We had a webinar about how to create a budget. So we can let you know about these opportunities. The next would be submit an application. And if you're invited to submit a non-competitive inquiry form, which again would go to the Minneapolis Foundation, and they'd make a decision about whether or not the project is a good fit. Once the Minneapolis Foundation receives the application, there might be a back and forth with a program officer to, if there's lack of clarity around the budget, for example, they would go back to the applicant and say, hey, can you just clarify this to kind of tighten up the application before it goes up to the Regional Advisory Committee. The Regional Advisory Committee makes a decision approximately 3 to 4 months. Again, that would kind of be the long end if the person turned in their application at the very beginning of a cycle. And what's really neat about this grant opportunity is that it's different. Rather than receive just a, oh, so sorry email, the Regional Advisory Committee will actually be giving feedback to applicants who do not receive the grant, and that applicant will be able to resubmit after making revisions. So that's a really nice nuance, especially for new applicants who haven't done grant writing before. And if an applicant receives a grant, then they start to work with a program officer to really clarify everything before the agreement is signed. We are starting to imagine, myself and my colleagues that work with tribal communities and urban communities are starting to think about, okay, once somebody gets a grant, we don't just want that to be it. The relationship is over, good job, you got your money. Rather, we're thinking, how can we support a grantee in the process of completing their project? So we've started to think about, could we bring in, if there's people are having a lot of trouble with compliance with EPA regulations, which we're trying to make as simple as possible, but it's the federal government, right? So we're trying to think about, could we bring in a consultant to give a presentation on compliance, for example? Or maybe there's a group of folks that are working on water issues, and maybe it would be worthwhile for us to bring in a consultant to do water testing training. So we're trying to think about maybe developing even cohorts around that to support people in these very specific technical assistance areas. Additionally, grantees will have me, if they're in rural communities, or my colleagues to be in touch with if things go awry. Life happens, people change jobs, and we want to work with grantees to make sure that they're still able to obtain the funding if they want to continue the project. They can work with program managers, and we're also thinking about peer learning circles so that folks can learn together. And even potentially bringing people together in person if that makes sense. So it's not, again, not just throwing money at a community and organization, but rather how can we support them? And these are just a few examples we thought about. We're really wanting this to be grantee-led. So if grantees have ideas about what kind of supports they need during the process of implementation, we're all open ears. Oh, and I already mentioned subject-specific webinars. One neat thing that we have available, or organizations and communities have available to them right now, is to work with REAMP staff. These are colleagues of mine. They're not funded by the EPA at all, but they're available to work with communities and organizations to find federal or state grants. They're a great resource, and there's this navigation request form, which then if an organization were to complete, they can be in touch with you and start to have a conversation about what the goals are and what resources are out there available. Again, the focus, but it's not exclusive. So if a community is suburban or even urban, they can still work with Ross and Kelly, but they may not be a higher priority than a more rural or capacity constrained organization or community. And with that, this is a direct link to our QR code to our website, where you can find out a lot more. But I'm happy to answer questions. If folks just want to raise their hand, I'm going to go ahead and stop share.
Thank you so much, Ryan. We did get a couple of questions, so while you're presenting, so I'll just go ahead and ask, can Tier 2 and 3 funds cover engineering studies and design toward a future infrastructure project?
What does future mean? The idea, I think, is that the effort would be made to be working on a project that would be completed fairly soon. It would be additional. Obviously, if there's that big of a project, it needs additional funds as well. So I think that would be a question a project manager might ask is, well, what is the timeline of this actual project? So if it's 10 years down the road, that might not be a good fit for this program. But if it's maybe 2 years where they're going to be able to complete a certain part or aspect of this construction effort, then that might be a good fit. So I think thinking through how does it fit within the feasibility and the long-term effort of that project, how long will it actually take? Thank you, Linda.
Yeah, that is a great answer. We did get a couple other questions from Laura. So she's asking, is there more definition for urban? If communities under 50,000 in population qualify as rural, what then goes into defining them as urban for the 45% grant portion?
So the EPA had made that determination that 50,000 is what they consider urban, and so we need to use that. So if the project is happening in a community, a city of 50,000 or more, then that would be considered urban. Now it's self-defined on the intake form and the application. It's the applicant notes which of the three grouping they're in. And if they're in a suburban area, we're not quite sure exactly what to do with those. It might be project dependent. But again, at the end of the day, all of these applications will be going up to a regional advisory committee, so other human beings. And these 10 folks are made up of a diverse demographic. They all have environmental justice, environmental sustainability. They all have kind of backgrounds in environmental work, and they are representative of the 6 states. So it's very diverse, and they will be the ones making the decision. So again, if it seems like a suburb, but it's more of a rural challenge or project, maybe they'll put them in the rural group. If it seems more like it's more of a city challenge or issue, urban, then maybe they'll put them in the urban group if it's not fully clearly defined by the applicant themselves.
Maybe I could clarify a little bit. This is Laura. So my question is really, the populations are less than 50,000. So my question is, if they're under 50,000, because you said 45% would go to urban, is there more than just that 50,000 in terms of population that defines urban? Could a community be less than 50,000, so it's rural by EPA definition, and then still apply for the 45%? Like how, when you say the 45% goes to urban, what does that actually mean? Like,
so 45% of the $40 million will be is earmarked to go towards urban communities and projects.
So
Now,
about 50,000 population?
yes, 50,000 or
Okay.
more.
Okay.
Now, I think I hear your question. Wouldn't it make more sense to try and apply where there's more money, percentage-wise? But in fact, it may not necessarily work out that way. What we're seeing is that there's a flood. There's many more applicants for urban because in part they have a lot more infrastructure to do these kind of projects than rural. And so it's not necessarily going to increase your chance just because there's more money, there's a lot more competition as well. So I would just be clear and say this is a population that we're working with, and so it fits within this category.
It looks like we are getting a lot of questions about eligibility and partnerships. Are partnerships allowed? And also, like, if a multi-county region is working together and the collective population is above 50,000, is that urban or is it the population based on the actual locations the projects take place?
Yeah, thank you, Linda. I can't say for certain, but I think the best thing to do is just to be clear on the application that this is the population that we're serving. So I live in just south Minneapolis, Bloomington. Our population is 90,000, and clearly it's an urban population. But if a bunch of counties are working together, and combined they make up more than 50,000, that's still rural because counties are often very big. And again, I don't think it's necessarily always going to be advantageous to try and apply for that bigger pot. It's also, if you're rural, you're rural. So unless you live in a city that's more than 50,000, more than 50,000 people, again, you're going to be considered suburban or rural.
Okay. For a regional project, what percentage of the population of the program has to be considered a disadvantaged community?
There's no percentage, but the idea is that within those census tracts, for example, the counties are very, very large. And so a project isn't necessarily going to be working throughout the entire county. It's going to be working in smaller communities of folks, or it's going to be affecting a group of people, as I mentioned, maybe farmers who all have different wells. Well, do they fit within that census tract that's defined as disadvantaged? And if the answer is there's no really percentage, but it has the vast majority, it has to be justified that the vast majority of the funding is going to these particular census tracts that are defined as disadvantaged.
Okay. And can you clarify if administrative costs are allowed for this program?
Yes, they are.
Perfect. Yeah, we've been getting a lot of questions, so I'm just trying to go through them. How about matching funds? How would that work?
This is really cool because unlike a lot of other federal grants, there can't be matching funds, but this grant can be used as matching funds. So if there's another federal grant that a group is getting, this can be used as a matching fund to that other federal grant.
Okay. We have a couple of people asking about the scale that a project occurs on. So Laura James asked, a lot of water quality projects happen on a watershed scale rather than a census tract scale. If a community leading a water quality project is in an orange census tract, but the project is being completed upstream in a non-disadvantaged census tract, could the project be eligible? So I think this is kind of like about where does the eligibility come in when it comes to being disadvantaged?
Thank you all. And I apologize if I'm not being completely clear because it is opaque. This is not a really easy answer. I think the best thing to do for many of your questions having to do with this eligibility would be to reach out to the Great Lakes Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center and work with them directly. So they could talk you through and they could look at the map with you and share with you whether or not it's whether or not you're eligible. I can't do that, and it's hard for me to generalize because it's true. There's a lot of people can make a real strong case. And in all honesty, I had to push back against the EPA because I didn't agree with their map. There's a lot of communities in rural Illinois, for example, throughout the region that are disadvantaged but weren't showing up on the map. And they have shared that they're working on it, but we have what we have. So my advice would be to work directly with the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers. And again, they can give you the best feedback.
Yes, and to clarify, myself and Rhonda Watts on this call, we are part of that Technical Assistance Center. So if you do have a lot of questions about eligibility, you are welcome to fill out our intake form and we can help field those and get more specific about your project needs. I am seeing some questions in the chat as well that are about specific projects. So you can also come to us with those questions as well if we're not able to get to it on this webinar.
Yes, Linda and Nancy, I'm sorry that I didn't mention that. You'd be the best first step for folks to reach out to. And on this call, I personally can't speak to any specific projects. I'm bounded by rules around the EPA. So if you have a specific project, again, please reach out to Linda and Nancy.
Yes, I'll try to fill some of the more general questions that Ryan can answer. So, for example, for organizations that are addressing different issues of environmental justice, in that situation, would you do 2 different grants or would you do 1 submission? Kind of clarifying that limit of the amount of grants you can apply to and how that works when you're doing different subject areas.
It depends on the project and it depends on the organization as well. If the organization has the capacity to work with communities as partners, and those communities, the funding or the funding will be going to those communities, then those communities can be considered essentially a separate entity. So again, the example that I gave was a regional development organization. They can take on, they could take on, we'll say six grants working with 3 different communities because they're the ones who have the capacity to accept those federal funds. They're recognized as a 501c3 or a municipality, local government, and so they can support communities in that way. So I would really focus on not trying to force things together to fit into this box, but rather to say we can get up to 2 grants. It's for this project, and we're working with this fiduciary sponsor. Again, the Regional Advisory Committee might be confused if things are kind of being squashed together and they aren't necessarily clear about how the feasibility or how this is going to work. Within the application as well, there's space to define and discuss the partnership. So that should also be clear as well. And the purpose is that it's community-led. So within that space that on the application, there should be a discussion about how this is a community-led project versus a kind of a top-down, this is what we think the community should be doing. These are great questions. Thank you all for asking.
Yeah, I am curious. Another question was asked, is there a breakdown of the number of grants funded per state?
No, not exactly. We're leaving it to the Regional Advisory Committee. We're giving guidelines about urban, rural, and tribal. And the guidelines also are that we're trying to have an equitable distribution. Now, what that actually means, is based on population? Is it just based on, it's like Congress, right? You have senators and you have Congress people. We're not quite sure, and we haven't nailed that down yet, but we're trying to be equitable across the 6-state region.
Okay, I'm going to give him 2 more questions from the chat, and then at that point we could move to people raising their hands if you wanted to ask your question verbally. So one question is, if applying for 2 tiers, can the project timelines overlap to complete different aspects of a larger community engagement project?
Yes, yes, and that would make a lot of sense, especially if an organization or community is able to say, we're building off of, we're laying down a foundation of education, and we're going to layer on top of that the implementation of a project. Absolutely.
Perfect. And we just have one more clarifying question about how the matching funds worked. So are they dependent on the funding of other funding, or should the projects be standalone aspects of a larger project? Just kind of how would that timeline, if you were using this as matching funds, work?
This funding is, I'm not sure exactly how to answer that. This funding is flexible, and it's there aren't a lot of restrictions about how this matches or doesn't match. So I'm not quite sure I understood the question, but I think that this funding is very, very flexible.
Okay. And do you have a detailed list of allowable costs that people can refer to?
We do not. I've never seen a list like that. But it generally is, if somebody has applied for federal funding or state funding, there's a kind of a clear list of things that are fundable and things that aren't fundable. But generally, again, if it falls within the range of, is this environmental justice, is it addressing environmental or public health issues? It seems to me that they would be, people could put those within their cost, within their budget. So, for example, there might be different types of equipment that need to be bought. That would be perfectly legitimate as long as it could be justified within the scope of their project.
Thank you so much for answering all of those questions. So yeah, if you want to raise your hand, if you'd like to ask a question verbally, please feel free to do so now.
I see Megan's question about whether it's required to complete or submit an intake form. The answer is yes. Again, the intake form is pretty short. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be exactly what you're going to be putting on the application, but it gives us a sense of whether or not folks are going to need resources. For example, translation. We ask a question like, do you need an application in a different language, for example? Things like that. So don't think about the intake form as being a barrier. It's just a way for us to start to be in conversation and make sure that an applicant has all the resources necessary to complete the application.
Is there anyone we didn't get to in the chat that would like to ask their question? I know there was kind of a flurry of them, so I'm sorry. I apologize if we missed anyone. Yes, Mark?
Yes, thank you, Ryan, for your work today. We're building a behavioral health care facility in my small county of under 30,000 people. We have a real problem with opioid abuse and meth and all of the above. And so we've come together to renovate a nursing home, taking half of it and turning it into a behavioral health care facility, along with our local hospital and mental health care workers. So my question has to do with alternative energy. We've already put in 210 geothermal wells to run the facility, but along with that, we'd like to put solar in as well to help pay for the electrical costs. And what I'm hearing you say is that if we apply for 50% of our solar through the Inflation Reduction Act, maybe 30% from the state of Illinois, we could possibly use this grant money to cover the other 20%. Am I correct?
This funding is very flexible. So this funding in general, again, I can't speak to specific instances, but generally speaking, it is absolutely worthwhile to state we have this bigger project, we already have this much funding, and we want this to be used as a supplement for the funding that we already have for this bigger project. That is completely allowable.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your work, Mark. That sounds really, really important. Dr. Ron? I think you're on mute.
Sorry. We are primarily technologists and looking to offer our technology expertise to people who would like to partner with us. And I'm wondering, where would you recommend that we go to? And we're interested in things from laurel land technology to monitor how asparagus is growing in a field and what the moisture is, to medical devices on migrant workers to monitor their blood pressure and other things, to do predictive modeling of possible healthcare issues to preempt possible crises. So one of my partners did his PhD at Purdue on artificial intelligence and blood pressure monitoring.
That sounds fascinating. And I would think that that would be a great partnership with a community or an organization working with the various disadvantaged populations that you have mentioned. So it would be a collaboration.
Well, where do I find those people? I'm actually a quadriplegic after a spinal cord injury, so I don't really go places. I'm all online.
I think Linda and Nancy have their finger on the pulse of organizations throughout the state of Illinois. So they might be a great resource. And if you wanted to go throughout the 6-state area, you could reach out to the different other technical assistance centers as well. But that would be the place that I would.
Yeah, and I'm actually in Ann Arbor, Michigan,
Okay.
and I have partners in Chicago, but I'm also looking at Oceana County, and somebody at Michigan State University is primarily working with children of farm workers in Oceana. And I targeted that because it's the largest Hispanic population in the state of Michigan, where Hispanics are kind of an invisible minority.
Yeah, and this might be another opportunity to work with our REAMP federal navigators who may be able to help you define and clarify this project. But again, I want to reiterate that this should be thought of as a collaborate or partnership where it's community led too. So ensuring that those voices of the community are being heard. And I don't think that would be a problem.
Yeah, I'm not looking, I'm 75. I'm not looking to lead anything. I'm just looking to offer my decades of experience with artificial intelligence. So I have a reason to get up in the morning.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for all that hard work up in Michigan.
All right.
Thank you for your question. So we did have another one that was about, can a city and or municipality work on behalf of a state-owned property that is vacant?
I don't think this would need to be clarified, but my understanding is that if the grant is going to an organization and going to be supporting disadvantaged communities, it's not quite as important who actually owns the land. So in that case, again, as long as the funds aren't going to the state, but they're going to this municipality, then again, just it would be good to double check, but I don't foresee any problems with that. I had a question. We had a question recently about whether or not project could be done on private property. And the answer is yes, as long as it's illustrating that the benefits are going to a disadvantaged community and not just to the landowner.
That makes a lot of sense. Does anyone else have any other final questions for Ryan before we wrap up? All right, well, thank you all so much. We will be sending out the recording and slides after this. And we'll also be sending some information on how to get in touch with us if you have more questions or if you have a specific project you're working on that you're looking for assistance. We may even be holding office hours if there is enough interest to kind of get through a lot of questions at the same time if they are similar. So thank you everyone so much, and especially thank you to Ryan for giving this amazing presentation and answering everyone's questions. We hope to see you all on our next webinar.